Hey, how's it going? In this video, we will be going through how to build a matchmaking tool using Airtable. To such effect, we will assume that we are running a venture capital event, a startup club, or something like that, where the idea is that we will send introductions so that startups get to meet potential investors. In that way, we have on a given table, startups, as you can see right here, where we have startups A to C. On a different table, it is that we have our investors, in this case, investors A to I, right? Now, how this works is usually, or the way in which we want to match the startups with investors is based out of a series of criteria, right? In this case, the criteria will be sector and stage. How this works is we have a sectors library table and the stages library table that we will use to assign such criteria both to startups and to investors. It is true that this could have been built using a single select field, such as, for instance, sector. However, the reason why that is not done in that way is that we are using the exact same criteria and the exact same values, for instance, fintech, edtech, biotech, both at a startup level and at an investor level. So if we go with the single select option, two things will happen. One, I need to type 2 times all of the different options, and also I might commit certain errors or typos that will or eventually could break my automations, right? That's why we will stick with the super reliant linked record field at a startup level right here and at an investor level right here. And that way we make sure that this will fully work. So let's say that our startup A is a fintech startup on a pre-seed stage. Startup B could be edtech at a series A stage, and for last, startup C could be an edtech at a seed stage or raising a seed fund round, right? So now if we go to investors, something similar should occur. We should say, hey, investor A is interested in investing in fintech, edtech, and biotech, meaning he's pretty much an agnostic investor in terms of sectors, and he only invests in pre-seed. Now, investor B invests in edtech in seed rounds, and investor C invests in biotech in both pre-seed and Series A. So the idea is that by the time I click on find potential investors, an automation will run that will match each of these startups with their potential investors, again, based on sectors and stages. To make this easier, we could actually get rid of this. And let's go ahead and let's build the automation. So we'll go to the automations tab. Do remember that every single automation includes a trigger. So the thing that will trigger this automation is when a record matches conditions. And there, what we will say is, hey, on the table startups, when the condition, which is find potential investors, is checked, is met, meaning the condition or the record matches that condition, then trigger the automation and do the following. The following being, hey, find records where if we kicked off the automation at a startup level, then I need to find the potential investors, right? So I'll go and find records on the investors table, once again, which match certain condition. Such condition being where? Actually, we will have 2 different conditions. So I clicked on add condition and we'll say, hey, where sectors of interest on our investor record has any of. If we click this gear right here, it allows us to set a dynamic value. So we will say where sectors of interest has any of dynamic value. If I click this plus button, I can now select the value which we are mapping, and this will be from the record which triggered the automation, meaning use data from the record that matches the condition, meaning the startup record, the corresponding sector, and given that this is a linked record field, we'll probably want to use the ID of the corresponding linked record to make sure that that is really unique. So that is one thing. Sector of interest of the investor has any of sector of the startup which triggered the automation, and stages of interest has any of, again, we click on the gear, we click on dynamic, and we click on this blue button to select the corresponding stage, again, the record ID of the record linked in the linked record field called stages on the startup level, or stage on the startup level, and let's see what we get. So let's go back. Let's say startups Okay, this one is checked, so we'll trigger this one. This is fintech proceed. If we go to our investors, we've got fintech proceed, this one, and let's have an additional one, maybe investor D. Let's make this guy invest in fintech proceed. So if we now go to the automation, we could test this. Startup A, hey, find which investors could be potentially interested in investing in Startup A. As mentioned, or as we went through a minute ago, those are investor A and investor D, right? So given that we found two records, we now want to create two new records under the matches table, where date will be today's date. By the way, that is a date field set to default to current date. Then we will want to stamp the corresponding startup or link the corresponding startup right here on the startup field, and do the same thing with the corresponding investor on the investor field. By default, the single select is set to pending, and then we can manually push it to intro send when we've actually did the introduction. Let's go back to the automation. And what we'll want to use here is a repeating group. What a repeating group does is it runs whatever action we have within such group for every item on the list, which is used as an input. So here, remember, we got two investor, that's a list of two records. So if we use such list of two records as an input for our repeating group, which we would do by clicking on select input, clicking on the find records action, this right here, this is showing the different actions, at least this first two, the actions on our automation, or the blocks on our automation. So I would select the records found and I would use them as a list. And then once we do that, or once we've done that, we would click on add action within the repeating group, and we want to create a record as mentioned on the matches table. Right there, the two fields that we will be populating are startup and investor. Reason why, because date and intro status will already be filled by default. And for startup, we'll say, hey, I want to link here the startup or the record ID of the startup that actually triggered this automation. So I'll select use data from other sources when a record matches conditions. This is the record which again triggered the automation, and we will be using its record ID. Now for the investor, this is different, because what I want to use is the investor that is being looked within this repeating group, which by the way was obtained from this find records. So if I click on this plus button, I want to make sure that I will be mapping the value from the current item from the list of records which is being looked, right? I do not want to select it from here, which are all investors, because this would return both investors within one same matches record. I want to select the current item, meaning that unique investor out of the list of two, right? And from them, I will be using the Airtable record ID. And that is pretty much it. So let's rename this to create matches or find matches and create. Let's turn this on and let's give that a shot. So if we go here, let's make sure this is unchecked. By the time we click here, this will run an automation, the one we just created. And as you can see, it created two records and linked them to the startup. Those were created under the matches table. So if I go back to matches now, you will see that I have these two records, startup A with investor D, startup A with investor A. That makes complete sense given that startup A, again, is a fintech raising a pre-seed fund, and investor A invest in fintech and pre-seed rounds, and investor, investor D invest in fintech pre-seed. So that makes complete sense. Let's give this an additional shot for each of these ones. Might or might not find matches depending on whether criteria is met. In this case, for startup C, it did find. So that's EdTech seed, investor B EdTech seed. That makes complete sense. So on our matches table, we now have all of the corresponding matches, and for sure we could be triggering additional automated emails by just doing a intro send, which would in turn send the corresponding emails if needed. Hope this is helpful, and do remember that this could be used for any other matchmaking need that you might have.